good evening, and it's a pleasure to see everybody here on time, and all those who are actually very eager to learn from our speakers today, Love Luthra and Prabhu Prem Kumar. They are all here, so let us, I think this is a very important topic, and I do congratulate the organizers who have given this COVID and thrombosis. I mean, it's probably the most important factor that is creating morbidity in the COVID situation. So let's start with the, and I'll just briefly talk about my chairpersons. It's Roy and Roy Varghese and Harinder Singh Bedi, and our panelists are going to be Dr. Deki Wadia, Dr. Rahul Jindal and Deepak Selvaraj, and everybody has been now we've been doing this season for quite some time, so now we know exactly what questions and how many questions they're supposed to ask or comments they're supposed to make. So let's please start with Dr. Love Luthra, and Vishal, please put on Dr. Love Luthra for his talk of 15 minutes on COVID and thrombosis. Thank you, and I'll mute myself now.
So, sir, first, shall we show the Sardia slide first?
Please, yes, please, yes, please.
Yeah, that is most important. Yes.
Fine, sir.
So please start the Sardia presentation.
Right, sir.
Okay, so today's program, as we've all been going through all this, is being sponsored again by Servier. And Servier India is actually the real name, Sardia, and it supports, and what Sardia supports, it supports the Make in India concept, like brands produced in India. There is no Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredient, and the API is sourced from France, and makes it very reliable. That's what you want. So thanks all the healthcare professionals and the supply chain and the pharmacists, because they and us and everybody here do understand that we are the frontline health heroes, including all the people who are supporting these programs. And that's the Facebook page of the VMove. I think this is becoming the single most important movement right now. And Poonam is spearheading everything. And that's something that everybody should keep on doing. And the town hall, and then the Facebook live stream. Of course, there are also participants on the Facebook. And join us tomorrow. And how does chronic venous disease evolve? And Devendra Deki Wadia has got some great information on there. That's the Indian Egyptian Forum that we're going to do on September 23rd. Again, very important. And is that the end of our slides? Yes. Yes. Okay, Vishal. Thank you. So shall I mute myself now?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So Love, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours, or the internet is yours, whatever you want to say that. So please, Love, please go ahead and tell us about what you know about COVID and thrombosis and enlighten us.
Yep. Good evening, everyone. Before I start, I would like to thank Venous Association of India for providing me with this platform to share my views on COVID and thrombosis. So, as of 16 September 2020, here we are. We had never imagined, but the truth is that we've crossed more than 50 lakh COVID positive cases in total. And still we have around 9,95,000 active cases, with deaths amounting up to 82,000. So I would like to share my views on COVID and thrombosis. Basically, the data that have been collected worldwide with and this data has been specially studied in the ICU patients, and a retrospective analysis has been done in most of the patients in ICU. And beyond any doubt, it has been proven that there is a significant relationship between coagulation and inflammation in severely ill COVID positive patients. Severe COVID-19 generates an increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines and activates endothelial cells, eventually leading to activation of tissue factor mediated coagulation. Further, the coagulation proteases bind to specific receptors that mediate the further pro-inflammatory responses. In this slide, we can see how the innate immunity is activated that results in activation and release of inflammatory cytokines. And then the inflammatory cytokines, how they activate the coagulation cascades, eventually leading to increase in the coagulation factors and the end products, increasing to leading to the increased levels of fibrin that further leads to coagulation disorders in patients with moderate to severe COVID diseases. Now, how is COVID related to the virtuous triad? As we all are very well versed, the virtuous triad has three arms: the hypercoagulability, venous stasis, and endothelial injury. Patients who are diagnosed COVID positive, they have fever, dehydration, gastrointestinal symptoms, and definitely the inflammatory responses within their system that activates the hypercoagulability. Now, the venous stasis is further enhanced by infections, patients because they are confined to bed, reduced mobility, hypotension, shock, and sedation, and in some cases in which mechanical ventilation is required. And endothelial injury is further induced by infusion of various medications and fluids, venous indwelling needles, mechanical ventilation, central venous catheterizations, and in some cases where surgery is done. Now, even the Lancet and the JAMA, they have in their various publications since Jan 2020 have proven beyond fact that definitely there is a relationship between coagulation disorders and patients with severe or critical COVID-19. A study was conducted in Wuhan. It was a single center study that included about 81 patients. Thromboprophylaxis was not given in any of the patients. And out of these 81 patients, 25% had DVT on routine scanning. Patients with DVT also showed increased levels of APT, D-dimers, and lymphocytosis. Another study, it included around 184 patients. There was 22% mortality, 43% patients were discharged alive. The cumulative incidence of VTE was 49%. 87% of all the thrombotic events were pulmonary embolism. Now, what are the various disorders that can occur in COVID-19 patients? Patients can have deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, arterial thrombosis. They can have cerebral vascular accidents, myocardial infarctions, acute limb ischemias, line-related thrombosis, and microvascular thrombosis. The lab characteristics of COVID patients include decrease in the platelet counts, mild or severely increased in increase in the prothrombin times. The fibrinogen levels are raised. There are elevated D-dimer levels, and especially patients who are on prolonged ventilatory support and have severe form of COVID disease, their D-dimer levels are drastically increased. The antithrombin levels, whereas, are normal. Now, does a very high level of D-dimer signify hypercoagulability disease, or it is just in severe inflammatory pulmonary disease in a COVID patient? There have been many reports, but still there is suspicion. Yes, D-dimer is a sensitive but not a specific marker for venous thromboembolism. But in severe COVID patients, the D-dimer levels have risen to more than up to 5,000 nanograms. Now, how do we classify the severity, the COVID disease? The mild, it is basically divided into 4 forms: mild, moderate, severe, and critical. Mild will have mild clinical symptoms. There are no imaging manifestations of pneumonia. Moderate patients with moderate disease have fever, respiratory symptoms, and only milder imaging manifestations of pneumonia. Whereas patients with severe disease have significant respiratory distress with respiratory rates equivalent or more than 30 minutes per minute. the resting oxygen saturation less than 93%, and the ratio of PaO2 to FiO2 less than 300 mm of mercury. In critical patients, the patients are in failure. They require mechanical ventilation. They are in shock. They have associated multi-organ disease associated with requirement of ICU stay. Now, how do we basically stratify the patients with whether they are in the high risk group or the low risk group? And do we need to evaluate them for the thromboembolic events? In low risk and high risk patients, if there is a clinical suspicion of VTE, we get a VTE imaging done. If imaging is feasible and it is positive, we start the therapeutic treatment for VTE or full dose anticoagulation. Whereas when there is no clinical evidence of VTE in patients, especially in low risk patients like patients who have low D-dimer levels, patients whose the inflammatory markers like C-reactive proteins, ESR, ferritin levels are on the lower range, normal or slightly raised than the normal, then standard VTE prophylaxis is indicated. Whereas patients who are in the high risk with D-dimer levels up to more than 2000, prothrombin time in more than around 3 seconds over the control, APTT more than 5 seconds over the control value, and significantly elevated inflammatory markers, high dose of VTE prophylaxis is recommended. Now, evaluation and treatment of patients and who are suspected COVID positive patients who have significant levels of D-dimer and we are suspecting DVT. In case of D-dimer or other coagulation indicators, if and when are monitored, if there is sudden sharp elevation of D-dimer accompanied with respiratory failure, we should we should go for the acute inflammatory reaction storm and disease progressions, and these patients should be evaluated further to rule out any visible cause of VT, like if they have any lower limb DVTs or in fact even upper limb DVTs. Patients who have upper extremity or superior vena cava catheterization, in these patients we should follow up them with ultrasonography of the upper extremity to rule out any deep vein thrombosis in the upper limbs. Now, as per the various studies, there have been a few guidelines that have been set up for prophylaxis and screening. In hospitalized patients with COVID-19, extended VTE prophylaxis can be considered in patients who are at low risk for bleeding and who are at high risk for VTE as per the protocols for patients without COVID-19. This has a evidence of B1. There are currently insufficient data to recommend for or against routine deep vein thrombosis screening in COVID-19 patients without signs or symptoms of VTE, regardless their status of the coagulation markers. Whereas in hospitalized COVID-19 positive patients, the possibility of thromboembolic disease should be evaluated in an event of rapid deterioration of pulmonary, cardiac, neurological function, or of sudden localized loss of peripheral perfusion. Now, VTE prophylaxis in relation to the stage of COVID-19. In early stage, that is stage 1, this is basically the viral response phase. In this, patients have mild symptoms, dry cough. There are no significant changes in the imaging. So in this, no anticoagulation is required. Whereas in stage 2, that is the pulmonary phase with 2A and 2B, patients presenting with shortness of breath, hypoxia, and have abnormal chest imaging, transaminitis, and low normal procalcitonin levels. Standard prophylaxis are required. If the patients are in the ward, the standard prophylaxis can be started in the ward. Whereas patients with stage 3, the hyperinflammation phase, these patients have ARDS, SIRS, or cardiac failure, and they have significantly elevated inflammatory markers. In this, intermediate ICU is preferred. Secondly, standard prophylaxis for anticoagulation is started. Now, the stage 4, the recovery phase, in this, the anticoagulation basically is given subject to the bleeding risk. What are the chest guidelines on prophylaxis? CHEST guidelines have very clearly mentioned that current standard dose of anticoagulation thromboprophylaxis over intermediate, low molecular weight in BD dose or increased weight-based dosing should be considered. In critically ill patients with COVID-19, current standard dose anticoagulant thromboprophylaxis over intermediate or full treatment dosing should be given as per the existing guidelines. The various societies, ASH, ACC, WHO, and NIH, have also come out with a certain group of certain set of guidelines. Now, as per the ASH guidelines, it is recommended that clinical trials or epidemiological studies should be done, and there is no fixed protocol, but they have very clearly proven that low molecular weight heparin is the best drug available, or heparin, than the other drugs, because these drugs have advantage of their shorter T halves, and then they have lesser interactions with the other medications because there is already an inflammatory response that is going on in a COVID positive patient. So he's already on the antivirals, antibacterials, other antibiotics, and steroids. So the use of low molecular weight heparins or heparins is beneficial in comparison to the DOACs or other anticoagulants. Now, what are the post-discharge treatment recommendations? Routine post-discharge VTE prophylaxis is not recommended for patients with COVID-19. However, the benefits of post-discharge prophylaxis for certain high-risk patients without COVID-19 led to a trial that included administration of rivaroxaban 10 mg daily for 31 to 39 days, and betrizaban 160 mg on day 1, followed by betrizaban 80 mg daily for 35 to 42 days. This trial, the inclusion criterion was there was a modified improved VT score of more than or equivalent to 4, modified improved VT score equivalent or more than 2, and a D-dimer level more than 2 times the upper limit of the normal. Age of the patient for more than 75 years, age of the patient more than 60 years, and a D-dimer level more than 2 times the upper limit of normal. In patients with 40 to 60 years with a D-dimer level more than 2 times the upper limit of normal and previous VTE event, or if the patient was suffering from any malignancy. So any decision to use post-discharge VTE prophylaxis should consider the individual patient's risk factors, including reduced mobility, bleeding risks, and feasibility. Special considerations during pregnancy and lactation: again, unfractionated heparin, low molecular weight heparin, and warfarin. They do not accumulate in breast milk and do not induce an anticoagulant effect in the newborn. Therefore, they can be used in breastfeeding women or with or without COVID-19 who require VTE prophylaxis or treatment. In contrast, DOACs are not routinely recommended due to lack of the safety data in pregnancy and lactating mothers. For patients with recurrent VTE, despite anticoagulation with therapeutic weight adjusted low molecular weight, it is suggested that increasing the dose of low molecular weight heparin by 25 to 30% may have good results. Now, why fondaparinux is preferred over enoxaparin? As we all know that fondaparinux has a once daily fixed dosing, and this dosing is weight independent. There is no need of monitoring of anticoagulant effect. The predictable dose response is independent of age and sex. There is no incidence of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, and there is minimal inter and intra-patient availability. Reasons to avoid DOACs in hospitalized COVID-19 patients, and why do we need to switch to low molecular weight heparins? Because we all very well know that DOACs cannot be given in patients with renal failures, liver failures, and these COVID positive patients, especially the patients with the severe form of disease, have multi-organ dysfunction, and they are on antiviral agents, antibacterial agents, and on steroids. So DOACs have a lot of interaction with all these agents. whereas low molecular weight heparins have minimal of interactions. What are the guidelines for DOAC management? We suggest that the patients taking chronic oral anticoagulant in the outpatient setting be switched to shorter acting agents when initially hospitalized for COVID-19 in case of clinical deterioration, changes in renal function, or need of invasive procedures. So what is our take home message from the data that we have gone through in all these 9 months? So it is very important to ensure all patients are risk assessed for VTE as well as bleeding risks. Ensure those at risk receive appropriate thromboprophylaxis adjusted for weight and renal function. Patients have a high index of clinical suspicion for VTE, but avoid routine screening for DVT and avoid inappropriate blood tests. Thank you.
Thank you, Love, for that overview and giving us this insight into especially the heparins and low molecular weight heparins and how to increase, fine tune the doses and everything. So that's been a great learning for, I guess, everybody, including myself. So let's move on to the second talk of Prabhu Prem Kumar, or the superficial vein thrombosis. So Prabhu, the net is yours and the cyberspace is yours.
Thank you, sir. Vishal, can I do my own sharing from here?
Yes, sir. Please.
You can.
Yeah, you can share your screen, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure for us to be here and represent this small topic, which doesn't seem to find much mention in this current world where everything is overshadowed by DVT. I bring you warm greetings from CMC Vellore, from Deepak, Albert, Wimlan, and all the other members here. All of us are extremely aware of India's first war of independence, 1857. Movies have been made about it. We have Mangal Pandey and stuff. But about 50 years earlier, a small little town in Vellore, the first violent against the modern British Empire took place in Vellore, the Vellore Mutiny. Just went back in our history books. Apparently, there's an entire page about the 1857 revolution, but the Vellore Mutiny is a small footnote in you can learn if you want to interested page in the history books. So we all talk about the glamorous DVT, but the small, humble superficial vein thrombosis is always mentioned as a footnote. It took India 200 years to recognize the Vellore Mutiny form for stamp. But politics apart, this is an example that SVT is a very real entity, and we do need to pay attention to superficial vein thrombosis. Traditionally known as thrombophlebitis. Please pardon the background noise. They're just doing some mosquito fogging in the hospital. And that too will pass. Like the COVID pandemic, this too will pass. SVT is known by many names, superficial thrombophlebitis. However, this term is best discouraged because it does not reflect the infection and inflammation are not the primary pathology. It is thrombosis pure and simple. If you look at the definition is of a painful, warm, erythematous, tender, palpable cord structure along a superficial vein. Our traditional teaching is self-limiting disease. Just give it some painkillers, it will go away. This is what we grew up on. as MS trainees and as MBA students. However, neo thinking is putting it right up there with DVT and pulmonary embolism. So why did that happen? From a benign self-limiting illness to a potential life-threatening disease, what happened? What changed? So here's a big shout out to Dr. Malay Patel. Malay sir, take a bow. All of us are extremely proud that you've been part of this landmark document. I know the names on this represent some of the best minds in venous disease. And to have you there and bringing on such a clear document, hats off to you, sir. Thankfully,
Thank you.
so what is the big do about venous thromboembolism and SVT? What is the association? There are tons of literature which has clearly documented why SVT and venous thromboembolism are so clearly linked. The fact is, we knew this from the early 90s.
Excuse me.
Yes,
sorry
Vishal.
sorry to interrupt you, but there's a background voice coming continuously from your end.
Yeah. I just need to apologize for that. They're doing some mosquito fogging in the hospital. So I'm going to try to be louder than the background voice.
Yeah, it seems that there's a wind voice or maybe a breath voice.
Yeah. Is it better now?
Yeah, please go ahead. It's fine.
Yeah. So from the early 90s, we knew that there is an association between DVT and phlebitis. But it took a very long time till this. Many studies came in the early century. One of the important studies that came about was this mega trial, and that had very clearly proven that there is a 6.3 times increased risk of DVT and a 3.9 times increased risk of pulmonary embolism in patients with clinical superficial vein thrombosis. This is not even documented, just clinical superficial vein thrombosis. And slowly people started paying attention and realizing that how important it is, this entity is. In France, in the early in 2014, there was a study, the STEP study, which looked at the incidence in about nearly 200,000 patients. Their incidence was 0.64 for every 1,000 patients, and mainly it is associated with varicose veins. This has been common knowledge for us for a very long time. Mortality, however, is less than 1%, as compared to DVT, where the mortality is close to 3 to 5%. SVT mortality less than 1%. Again, these definitive mortality studies have come out only over the past 4 to 6 years. Classification of superficial vein thrombosis underwent a major change once the consensus document came out. Here it is divided into varicose veins associated SVT and non-varicose veins associated SVT. And then the third smaller category was SVT on healthy veins. What is crucial to understand is that though we know that the background of varicose veins is the commonest factor, there are many other conditions that cause SVT, and they actually serve as markers if we only are able to pick it up early. As Love pointed out, the risk factors for SVT is also the same for Bischoff's triad. Looking at endothelial injury, it's trauma and usually iatrogenic. Venous stasis, again, varicose veins forms the main culprit. In the hypercoagulable states, two important factors are malignancies and these factor V latent and prothrombin factors, which we usually don't check for. When we talk of investigating a patient, there are two goals that we really need to look at. One is, where is this thrombosis physically occurring? And second point, is there a DVT? The third point, which does not find much mention in our clinical practice, is why is it occurring? What has caused this SVT to occur? So that's where the paradigm shift has come from a benign self-limiting disease to a potential marker for malignancy and deep vein thrombosis. Most of us treating these patients do so on clinical diagnosis. In clinical, we say, okay, this patient has got in clinical diagnosis, we say that the patient has got an SVT. And then patients go on to do ultrasound. Looking at to identify the causes. One, test for congenital or acquired hypercoagulable states. In this, the commonest factor that is found from this mega study was factor V latent mutation. This is also quite common in the Indian scenario, but we don't go chasing for it in a patient with SVT. Again, we need to look for malignancies, of which adenocarcinoma of the pancreas. I'm seeing a pop-up saying, please move window away from shared application. Is that something, Vishal, do you want to, is that something that?
I don't know why it's coming.
Okay, no problem. If we'll carry on.
Yeah.
So we also need to look at malignancies, of which adenocarcinoma of pancreas is one of the commonest, followed by carcinoma of colon. Again, this comes out of the mega study that was done. I know in our busy OPDs, a patient with SVT doesn't get much time. But here's where we really need to do a clinical examination. We know that malignancies can forewarn us with SVT. With that in mind, rectal examination, checking the thyroid, checking the abdomen. In a lady doing a vaginal examination, may not be us, but at least referring it to the gynecologist, checking for the breast malignancies, looking at other causes are absolutely low. Look for malignancy. We know this D-dimer has now come to stay, but it is a non-specific test as far as SVT is concerned. As Love elegantly pointed out, it's a negative predictive value. If the D-dimer is high, it doesn't mean much. But if it is low, we can say with reasonable certainty that a thrombotic event is not happening. The other point that we need to mention, again, I'm re-emphasizing clinical evaluation, is check the peripheral pulses. If the peripheral pulse is absent, hand on my heart, I know for many patients we have not done this. I have not done this. The most important complications is hyperpigmentation, abscess formation, not to mention DVT and PE. There are two treatment goals in treating patients. One is to reduce the acute symptoms. Two, look for venous thromboembolisms. Recommended now is to anticoagulate. Anticoagulate. The role of surgery has become quite controversial, and frankly, we've given up doing this over the past several years. The key factor is to anticoagulate patients if the thrombosis length is more than 5 centimeters, if it is near the junctions. If any other risk factors for DVT, please anticoagulate. I know fondaparinux has been cannot afford fondaparinux. So warfarin, acetylcholine, the NOACs are a good alternative, and at least for 45 days. We all need to give some symptomatic treatment, analgesia, topical heparins, and that all works well. But the key thing that we need to take home is anticoagulation. Compression therapy also is good. Once the patient can tolerate it, it helps to improve the venous flow, allow the patient to be as active as possible. We start with short stretch bandages and followed by support stockings. All this is evidence up to now. What is the way forward for us as a society, as people who deal with this routinely? We need to make our other colleagues aware. We need to make our other medical fraternity aware of SVT. And we need to treat the patient as protocol-based management, individualize the treatment, and not use a single yardstick for everybody. We are crying out for research, especially Indian data. One of the key lessons that we learned from Sunil is that whenever we present from Vellore, we always try to have our own experience. Vascular surgery, where we have looked at SVT. Having moved to an electronic platform in our hospital, it has really worked wonders for us. I'm showing you this slide to see that any patient who comes with a particular disease, we mark it in our clinical workstation. If you see there are several, this is only a snapshot, but SVT And earlier, before we really came to working on it, it's called superficial thrombophlebitis. So if we have, if it is possible, we mark the study, and then later it's possible for us to pull out the patient data and at least analyze both retrospective and prospective. These are our figures. We looked at our data from past 9 years, from 11 to 18, a retrospective study. We had a total of 85 patients who presented with pure superficial vein thrombosis, 32 patients who presented with superficial vein thrombosis and deep vein thrombosis. Again, as is our predominant Indian presentation, men seem to be factor for the most, the mean age group being in the 40s. Here's where the data becomes interesting. When in the SVT, 73 patients were diagnosed as on OPD based just on clinical findings. Whereas in the deep vein thrombosis SVT group, 29 patients were diagnosed after they had done an imaging. Again, this is reflective of the way our paradigms have changed over the past 10 years. Looking at the SVT group, though 73 patients on clinical diagnosis, 67, most of them went on to have a Doppler for confirmation. Whereas in the DVT group, all of them had Dopplers done. Our involvement, mainly the great saphenous vein, some in the short saphenous vein. The majority of the patients diagnosed SVT are in the tributaries of the venous systems. Again, as is published in literature, 81% of our patients are varicose veins related. Coming to the treatment part, over these 9 years, we found that only 1/5 of the patients actually had anticoagulation. Surgery anticoagulation, 4%. Symptomatic treatment, most of the patients. I looked at the data, and these patients fall in the initial part of the 9 years, whereas these patients seem to fall in the later half when our awareness is much, much more that anticoagulation is the way forward. These 17 patients, or 1/5 of the patients, again were from 2011 to 2016. After that, we've not done any surgery for superficial vein thrombosis. I'd also like to point out that one patient in the retrospective cohort progressed to deep vein thrombosis, while 3 patients progressed to pulmonary embolism. They all presented a few weeks after they had come to the OPD with superficial vein thrombosis. Now, this is significant because if we are missing these patients, then they're going elsewhere and having complications when we had a chance to treat them early. We analyzed the risk factors. 20% of the patients had a background of venous thromboembolism, and 65% had varicose veins. We picked up 3 malignancies, 1 autoimmune disease, and 2 patients who had come with pregnancy. Again, 14 patients, we don't know what the cause for SVT is. We look at the drugs used. Warfarin and acetylcholine still formed the major bulk of the patients who received anticoagulation, and NOACs were of the past few years beginning to come into fashion. If you look at the duration of anticoagulation in our cohort, about 18 of the patients have had some form of anticoagulation, and more than 3 months, similarly 18 patients. 5 patients have lifelong. These patients are the ones whom we picked up malignancies and the ones on PE. Putting this all together, this is the algorithm that we have developed. Somebody comes to our clinics with superficial vein thrombosis. The first thing is to check the pulses. If they're absent, investigate the arterial system. Look for Buerger's disease and other arterial disorders. If they are present, which veins are involved? If the axial and deep veins, great saphenous, short saphenous veins are involved, then start anticoagulation, invest for possible causes. If the axial veins are not involved, this is the most sinister group. Look for malignancy, look for other causes for SVT. In conclusion, the take-home messages are, SVT is no longer an innocuous disease. We need to treat adequately with anticoagulation. We need to look for causes, especially malignancy, and individualize the treatment to your patient. Awareness, education, research. Finally, as I close this presentation, I just want to pay homage to Professor Sunil, was so instrumental in mentoring and teaching Deepak, me, and others, who brought this paper, who guided us this paper, friend, teacher, mentor, and so much more. Thank you all for your patient listening.
Thank you, Prem Kumar, and with that wonderful presentation. And in the meantime, as I hand it over to the chairpersons, now that we are in the middle of the program, I'd like to once again congratulate and commend the Office of the VAI, and especially Rahul for overseeing everything, and Roy, of course, for presiding over everything, and Harry and Deepak and all the office bearers and the leaders of the VAI. So please, chairpersons, you can take over now. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, please. Yes, today has been an excellent day, and both the speakers have spoken well. And the topic is very, very important. First question is to Dr. Love Luthra. See, most of us do understand and agree that heparins and low molecular weight heparins are the most important modality for treatment of these thrombotic events. But many of the molecules, especially those coming from a neighboring country, have this chondroitin sulfate or other impurities, which may mask the efficacy and give potential complications to the patients. Is there any way that we can think of getting good quality heparins and low molecular weight heparin? My second question is to Dr. Prabhu, because he is also involved. See, many of the superficial vein thrombosis, especially in elderly ladies and patients of the older generation, may have underlying malignancy, as you rightly told. Is an ultrasound abdomen and the thyroid a worthwhile investigation? Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the comments. For your question, thromboprophylaxis required in the post-discharge period in COVID-19 patients. I'd like to repeat myself again. As of now, the studies that have been conducted in Europe, in China, even in America, they have come out with this conclusion that thromboprophylaxis is not indicated. And if thromboprophylaxis is needed in a particular set of patients, we have to keep in mind the associated risk factors that we routinely assess our patients who are not even before COVID. If we were giving thromboprophylaxis post-discharge to our patients, we assess the risk of bleeding and the indications why we needed that. So first of all, there is no need for thromboprophylaxis in COVID-19 patients post-discharge until and unless they have the risk factors, thrombotic risk factors. Like there are few patients who were previously, before being diagnosed with COVID-19 or before being, they fell to COVID-19, if they were on antiplatelets, post-discharge, yes, it should be continued. Secondly, the efficacy of various drugs in post-discharge, like I had one slide also, DOACs, beyond any doubt, have proven much better than the normal vitamin K antagonists we use, because they have advantages over vitamin K antagonists that no monitoring is required. Yes, in patients who have contraindications for the use of DOACs, like patients with renal failure, patients with liver failure, pregnant ladies, lactating mothers, and then definitely low molecular weight heparin or heparin has a better efficacy. And now coming to the second part of your question, sir, I think the little knowledge that I have is regarding the molecule, I feel that for low molecular weight heparin, enoxaparin, Clexane is the original molecule. But in market, the other companies, enoxaparin are also manufactured. But the little knowledge that I have, I think only Clexane is the original molecule for enoxaparin. The rest all are modified or they've taken from themselves.
Thank you.
Well, specifically to your question, so in elderly patients, elderly women, especially who had SVT, should you do an ultrasound abdomen and look for malignancy? Thank you for that question. this is the way we have looked at it. If it's a very old person and you know that we're not going to, there's not a great many years left, there's no point chasing it. But if it's a person who's still got full of vim and vigor and is going about life, managing activity, daily living, then it is probably, in our opinion, best to do an ultrasound abdomen, look if there's any malignancy, anything that can be done.
Thank you. Harinderji, it's up to you now. Thank you.
Good talks, Love and Prabhu.
Thank you, sir.
Well, to Love, see, in Love, you gave a nice talk. Now, I want to go one step further, especially in view of the fact that the few autopsies that have been done, I missed out whether you showed the autopsies or not, but anyway, there were some autopsies have been done which showed in patients who died, of course, that they were riddled with clots in the pulmonary arteries and other places. So my hypothetical question to you, not hypothetical, actually it's a practical question in view of a fact that I'll tell you, that would you take a leap of faith if you were the treating doctor in a patient who's, you know, moribund and his oxygen is not coming up at all? Would you consider systemic strong thrombolytic agents like TPA? And the example I'm giving is one of our own colleagues. In fact, he's published in one of our journals. He was not treating, but he was looking after his own father, and against the advice of the treating physician, he gave TPA and apparently it worked. You don't know for sure, that's just one case. But would you take a leap of faith and give a stronger thrombolytic than just oral anticoagulants? And then I'll ask Prabhu later on. So Love, on to you.
Sir, the use of thrombolytic agents in COVID positive patients, because again, the few articles that I went through, again, they've mentioned it clearly, if can be used in case there are no associated risks of bleeding, or like patients are already in multi-organ dysfunction, patients with severe COVID. Secondly, I also went through the case you were talking about, one of our seniors from Gujarat, who himself treated his father. As per his treatment, his father actually recovered with thrombolytic.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think we should keep that in mind. It's not a NATO standard protocol, but it's something
Yes,
at the
sir.
back of mind. Thank you.
Yes, sir, definitely. I think it can be, part of our treatment kit in case if patient is not responding to anything, maybe probably thrombolytic agents have a role to play, sir.
You'll have a difficult to convince the intensivist. I don't think they
Yes,
might
they
agree,
will.
they might not.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Prabhu, one thing you probably missed out, I heard your whole lecture, is that there is a limited indication for intervention in SVT. I'll give you an example. One case we had and one which is published by an Egyptian group, a patient with SVT but recurrent DVT and one episode of pulmonary embolism. So what they did and what we did also was, it was a little low in the thigh, so we just ablated the saphenofemoral junction. You know, you can go above the clot. So that's a limited indication of intervention. Surgery, definitely I would not do, but we may think of this when there is a recurrence of clot going into the venous system, deeper venous system.
Absolutely. If there's a recurrence of SVT, then it's probably worth ablating that segment.
Now questions, actually there are no questions, but anybody from the panel can
Yes,
please ask. Yes, go ahead please.
Prabhu, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Now, we all know the link between DVT and deep vein thrombosis and malignancy. Now, of late, we've seen, from your lecture, there is a possibility of a small percentage of cases with superficial vein thrombosis and malignancy, associated malignancy. So if you just treat the superficial vein thrombosis, you might actually miss out on a malignancy. So can you tell us if the risk is very less, or is the risk is fair enough for us to actually investigate for all these least do an ultrasound or whatever investigation to make sure that the patient doesn't have any malignancy. Because of late I've seen a couple of patients in my clinic who actually have come back 6 to months or 1 year later with ovarian malignancies and pelvic masses, pelvic small tumors in pelvis.
Deepak, thanks for the question. It's a very pertinent question. All of us are so clued in DVT malignancy association. We look for it. First time DVT, we look for it. Similarly, though not in the same intensity, SVT also is a precursor for malignancy. There are more and more anecdotal reports that have been coming out in the oncology journals where patient has presented with some form of thrombosis. So if there is a patient who comes to our health facility with SVT, it's probably best for us to look for all possible malignancies that we can in the clinical examination, and definitely ultrasound abdomen and a gynae examination is recommended for a patient, for a lady patient. Yeah.
We invite questions while we are waiting. I'll ask 2 questions from the Zoom, the chat group. Dr. Ashish Dhadas, would you like to Prabhu, what would be your take on offering endovenous ablation in a patient with localized? I think you already answered that.
Yes,
that
that's
there
true.
Is recurrence.
Yeah, recurrence,
Then,
yes.
Sharyu Gore, what is the role of aspirin? I presume she's asking both the speakers. I would say no role, but I would like to hear both of you. Role of aspirin.
Anandar, I would fully agree with you. As far as SVT is concerned, aspirin is an anti-inflammatory. We know the pathology in SVT is not inflammation. Aspirin was traditionally thought that it will heal or cure the SVT. Now we know that giving aspirin does not play, it helps reduce the inflammation, reduce the pain, but it does not take away the cause for the thrombosis. So if you're giving it as a pain relief, that's fine. But giving it as a treatment is probably not recommended.
Love, aspirin in COVID thrombosis?
Yeah, in COVID thrombosis, aspirin has no role in post-discharge period until and unless patient was previously on antiplatelets. Otherwise, there is no role. But definitely in post-discharge periods, anticoagulants do have a role to play, especially in those patients who are at high risk. Otherwise, aspirin has no role in COVID-related thrombosis.
Any comments by Rahul or Deki on anything? Not the questions. Any comments as such?
Yeah.
Harry, can I? Okay, Rahul, go ahead. Rahul, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. And Love, I've just got a small comment for you.
Yes, sir.
You see, there is regarding the guidelines post-discharge thromboprophylaxis. So we are still, the data is still coming in. And so in the guidelines goes that if you have a moderate to severe COVID, so it means if you were admitted in the hospital, so then post-discharge, you can continue the anticoagulation for 7 to 14 days. So we still don't know the exact duration of anticoagulation, what should be given. And what has been proposed in another study was that you measure the D-dimer levels on discharge or after 7 days. And if your D-dimer levels are normal, then you don't need to continue the anticoagulations. While you're giving the anticoagulation, you also need to look into the platelet count, because the platelet count can really drop in the COVID patients, and these things should be done. Regarding SVT, we see around 8 to 10 patients a month with SVT in our practice. And what we have done as a protocol, just learned with the practice is, if you have an SVT related to the varicose veins, so you have a dilated varicose veins, and then you got a clot formation, then we don't investigate it thoroughly. So we do the basic blood tests like, CBC, LFTs and CRAT and everything, and anticoagulate the patients, and then do a laser therapy for the varicose veins. At present, in last 16 years practice, we haven't come across a single guy with varicose vein, with SVT, later presentation with malignancy. And so that's what we do. And more than nearly 60 to 70% SVT comes with the varicose veins. But once the 30-35% of the patients who come to you with an SVT without the varicose veins, so we investigate them fully. for malignancy, from chest X-ray to abdominal CT scans, malignancy, everything. And in those cases, two important findings, what we have found is in some cases a thrombophilia, if the patient has a recurrent SVT, and the second is the malignancy. And third is we don't find any cause at all. And we give the anticoagulation for 6 weeks, then they have a recurrent SVT, investigate them further again, then still we continue the anticoagulation, but we still can't find any cause why the recurrent SVT is happening without any cause.
Can I make a point on aspirin? I think aspirin's role as an antiplatelet may be the only thing that you want to use it for in these cases. So once you've done your anticoagulation, if somebody feels comfortable or somebody feels insecure, then they can give aspirin for some time. But I don't see there is any evidence. Now, one more comment, that Love's talk on the COVID and thrombosis. I was wondering if the VAI could think of getting this as a sort of a guideline into the Indian Journal of Surgery, because it would encompass all, or the API or the API journal or whatever. I mean, I'm just putting in an idea. I'm not pushing or saying anything definitive.
Sir, I think it's a good idea because as you know, I reviewed the literature last week on COVID and thrombosis. So I gave a lecture on the national platform, and I think it's a good idea that from Venous Association of India we can put in a review article with 7 or 8 authors. And we already got the literature, and we can we can make a rough draft and circulate it among you guys. You can add on the comments and make the corrections and all, and then we can submit it as a publication in the journal, and Love can lead the things.
Yeah.
And
that's what I thought, because this TPA thing, thrombolysis, as what Harinder mentioned, I've read that story. Makes a charming story, of course. Wow, heart touching, but it's still not science, basically. So.
Okay, sir. We will push that through, and so you are going to hear from us in 2 weeks.
Dr. Dekhi, any comments on anything?
Yeah, friends, I'm sorry I couldn't join on. So there is a lot of audio disturbance, but the discussion what Rahul was making, I could understand it well. And we have got our experience of superficial thrombosis and associated with varicose veins, and the varicose bunches get thrombosed. Here we do find when the WBC count is high, we have to give additional antibiotics. We do consider giving aspirin in these patients. And once their inflammation and pain has reduced, then we operate on the varicose veins, the EVLT, whatever procedure we have to do. The other part is isolated GSV thrombosis or SSV thrombosis without varicosities. We have observed few patients where once they come with a right lower limb problem, after 6 months with the left lower limb problem, but so far not in a single case we have observed malignancy coming up later on. So that is what our little experience is. I hope my audio is audible, Harinder, or
yes.
The voice is cracking.
Very well. No, your voice is strong.
It's audible, sir. It's audible.
Yeah. Okay. We have very heavy rainfall here and a lot of unstable net. So, right, guys.
We are missing the photograph at your back. We're missing the photograph.
I'm at the farm. Today I'm not at home. I'm at the farm.
Yes.
Due to sharp rise of cases in Rajkot, we have reshifted. We have closed down the hospital. Daily there are 30-40 deaths, and there are queues in this smashan. There are 6 smashans, and there is a waiting list in the smashan now. So we have shifted here, unfortunately. Stopped down the work.
So I think if there are no further questions, then we could call it a day. I take this opportunity to thank, we have a gracious guest who has joined us all the way from Mexico. And that's a Flebo friend, Miss Coral. Probably she cannot talk to us, but thank you, Coral, for joining us. And we'll be inviting you also for all our talks in case you're interested. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, the speakers, my co-chairman, Malay, and all the panelists. That was a wonderful discussion and we all enjoyed. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.